We're going to start off this chapter about ballistics talking about guns. Obviously, we can't talk about the forensics evidence of guns and why certain things are important about how we collect it or how we analyze it until we understand how guns work so that we have a sense of understanding. So let's talk about these types of guns. One of the big themes that we're going to see in ballistics is that oftentimes individualization is possible. Remember, we talked about individual evidence is evidence that can be linked to one one source. So that if I have two pieces of evidence that share certain individual characteristics, that means I know they came from the same source. In this particular case with guns, I can say this bullet or this casing came from this particular gun, this individual gun, not just this class of guns. So that's a big deal. If I can link then that weapon to a certain person or that bullet to a certain victim. So now I can have some information that's very helpful. We will see that there's unique wear and impressions that occur on these bullet casings, on the cartridge casings shot from a gun, or on bullets themselves. We can get striation marks on the bullets or on the cartridges, on the casings of the cartridge from passing through a rifle barrel. We can get scratches on those firing impressions sometimes, and those scratches are very unique. We can get scratches, wears, abrasion on also other things besides guns, like tools, shoes, tires. We talked a tiny bit about this last chapter. Serial numbers on guns, obviously, are individual. And then teeth marks is another type of impression we could have that's very individual. And then we have some class characteristics that are obviously not unique, not individual. Things like what caliber of gun was used, rifling characteristics that won't tell me an individual gun, but it will tell me it was from this type of rifled barrel, or firing impressions. So that's what we're aiming to get out of understanding the types of guns. Now, we generally break up guns into two classes, handguns and long guns. And handguns are designed to be shot with one hand, hence the name handgun. Long guns are designed that they need two hands, one to hold the barrel and one to sort of brace it, that sort of has to be braced against a shoulder or something, because they're much longer, so they generally need a hand to hold and a hand to activate the trigger. So when we talk about handguns, we're talking about what we call single-shot pistols, revolvers, and then semi-automatics. And then on long guns, we're talking about rifles and shotguns. Let's talk about handguns for a little bit. Again, the single-shot pistol is very old-style kind of gun where one bullet, one gun, you shoot it, and after you shoot it, you have to completely reload it. The revolver kind of came next in the types of guns where now you have a revolving chamber that has generally six bullets in it. So now you don't have to reload it. You do have to rearm it, recock it, but you don't have to open it up and change out the bullet. And then we move into semi-automatic pistols, which have a magazine of many cartridges, and so they still need to be one trigger per fire of the gun, but I don't have to reload it. That's kind of an automatic reloading. That's the big deal with those. All of these feature cartridge ammunition. We'll talk about what's in a cartridge that includes a bullet, and that bullet can be they all have lands and grooves on their rifling barrel to help the bullet, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Long guns, on the other hand, they come in lots of varieties. Again, it could be a single shot, it could be a repeating, could be semi-automatic, could be automatic. So how many shots and how much you have to do to prepare the next shot are all sort of features of them. And it's really broken up into two categories, shotguns and rifles. Shotguns will have a shell that contains numerous little, pellets, balls, and they call those shot. And then the barrow is a smooth barrow, and it kind of narrows down to and that's called the choke, and can concentrate the shot when fired, but there's not going to have what we're going to talk about, these rifling characteristics, whereas rifles still have that barrel that has what we call lands and grooves on it, and that rifling helps to shape the trajectory of the bullet, and it leaves impressions on it. That's why we care about it. So it's got a cartridge ammunition with a bullet. So the shotgun is the only one that has shot. In the end, all the other ones shoot some kind of bullets. So it will have a cartridge ammunition that includes the bullet that can be impressed with that the rifling characteristics. So when we talk about the parts of a handgun, again, these are sort of looking at, we see some similarities. Not all of them are identical, but there is quite a bit that's similar. So here's the cartridge, the ammunition that I put in them, and the cartridge is kind of the same. The cartridge contains a bullet, but it's bigger than a bullet. And then I have a barrel that is rifled. We'll talk about that in a minute. Again, this barrel would also be rifled. It's not showing those. And then I have my, generally all of them, both of them have a barrel. So I have a firing pin that actually sets it off. Again, both of these have a firing pin. The ejector can be a little bit different. So this one has a specific ejector. This one, I believe in this particular one, the ejection is sort of part of the mechanism. May not be. And then we have our down here. We have our, in here, the bullet gets loaded. This would be a single one. Here would be more ready to load, the magazine cartridge of more ammunition. And they all have a trigger and a trigger guard, right? This thing here is called the trigger guard, so that if you just grab it, you can't hit the trigger. But then this is the trigger itself. And so we see a lot of similarities. Let's get to know the names a little bit. Okay, let's talk about the ammunition that goes in it. In general, rifles and handguns are going to have cartridges. So you have a cartridge that has a bunch of pieces to it. They're all going to have a casing that's kind of holding the whole thing together. They're all going to have a primer. This primer is an initial, it creates an initial explosion that sets off the bigger explosion. So this can be set off very easily, but it's not a very big explosion. And that will be set off by the firing pin. And then the powder in here is going to be basically the source of fuel for the bigger explosion. And this, the primer explosion sets off the powder, which is the bigger explosion, which then ejects this bullet. So we have a bullet encased in a casing, and you have a primer at the end of it. And then there's a lot of variations to this, what kind and specific size and how much stuff, and whether we have wadding in here. Sometimes some of them have wadding in there, some do not. So then we have shells that are used in shotgun. So in this case, we're not ejecting one bullet, we're ejecting lots of little pieces of shot. So here's my shot here. Again, we also have this cartridge outer shell. And down here we have, we still have a primer down here. This is my little primer area that's going to be set off. And here we still have sort of this outer part of the cartridge that's holding it all together. We have wad. Now I have my primer that's going to set off some kind of powder, still have a bigger explosion. This small explosion sets off this big explosion that has to be separated from the shot by this sort of, wadding here. Oh, this arrow is kind of showing that this is the wadding. So this is the powder. This is the wadding. And it's kind of it's sort of a pretty solid type of paper or stuffing in there. They can kind of separate it just so that it doesn't mix. So as that big one goes off, it then pushes against the wadding. The wadding pushes out the shot. And here's my shot. Okay, so let's talk about the sizing of these different ones. And again, now we start getting a little more into general things. For handguns and rifles, we use the same sizing. We are going by that, the caliber is what we call it, and we're talking about the bore of the barrel. That's what's going to determine it. Now, and when we say, there's, as you look at this, and we're going to talk about this in more detail in the next section about impressions, that the rifle or the barrel has of a handgun has these lands and grooves, right? So some of it is this inner diameter on the high sides, which are called the lands, and some of it is this outer diameter, outer of the two inner diameters. So when we say the bore, we're talking about this distance here, from the smallest distance on the inner parts of it. So we go into, when we say a 22 or a .22, that's 2.22 inches. So when we say a 22, it's meaning a 22 100ths of an inch is the size of it. So notice as we go up in number, the bore is a bigger size. And then of course we have some metric ones, so 9 millimeters. So in order to compare a 9 millimeter to a 22, you'd have to do a metric conversion between inches and millimeters to sort of see where do they compare. So this is how we would size it, is basically by the size of the bore. Not so much with the shotguns. Okay, barrel rifling. So now let's talk a little bit more about these lands and grooves. If you look at this, it's sort of like this twisted, you can see the sort of looking in on it, where you can see it's got grooves cut into it, but the grooves are cut into it on a twist. And those grooves help sort of, as the bullet is being ejected, it helps twist the bullet. Just like if you're shooting a football, if you give it a little bit of spin to it, it helps you get it goes farther, and the accuracy on the aim is a little bit better. It tends to stay on target, and that's the point of the rifling in both of these. So we have these sort of grooves cut in, and they're twisting. And we will generally calibrate, so we call the grooves themselves are the grooves, and then the part that didn't get cut when you cut the groove is called a land. So the high spots are the lands, and the low spots are the grooves. And so that's really helping with the getting a good trajectory, so that we get much better aim on wherever you set out to hit. It's much more likely that you're going to hit it. This is a pretty good picture of a rifled barrel cut aside, where you can kind of see what's going on. So we can characterize, and we'll talk about this later, a barrel by the number of lands and grooves that it has in it, and you really can't get the angle from it. And so that will be part of what, now that's going to be a class characteristic, because all of the identical guns made by a certain manufacturer are going to have the same number of lands and grooves, the same barrel size, so those will be very similar. What will be individual is the scratches that occur as it's going through there, and we'll talk about that in the next section. Okay, shotgun sizes, size totally different. They're not sized by the barrel, they're sized by the shot itself. And so that gauge is related to the, so you can have a gauge related to the diameter of the shotgun barrel. So that is going to be, but the way we measure the bore is by how much, if you filled it with shotguns, with little pellets, how much weight would it take? It's a very bizarre kind of thing. So if you were to fit one lead ball the diameter of the barrel, how many would it take to weigh a pound? That's the sort of thinking on it. It's too hard to figure out. It's just easier to sort of memorize. But what we do see is that as the actual diameter of the barrel gets bigger, we see the gauge get smaller. So we have, ignore the 410 because that's kind of unusual. That one's actually not by the gauge of what the ball is that would fit in there. That's actually a true measurement of the bore is 41 hundredths of an inch in diameter, or 410. But for all these other gauges, we see as the gauge gets smaller, the diameter of that bore gets bigger. I hope that's helpful. So it's a little bit of a confusing way. The idea would be this 10 gauge, if I had a lead ball this big, because they're so big, it wouldn't take as many of them to weigh a pound. Whereas down here with this 28 gauge, what this means is that if I put a lead ball in there that would just exactly fit in this 0.55 inch diameter, and then I put it on a scale, it would be, I would take 28 of them. It's 1/28 of a pound. And here it's 1/10 of a pound because these are bigger. So the bigger take-home message is that the bigger the gauge, the smaller the diameter. Now again, that's gauge. A 410 is actually off of the actual size of the bore.